Okay, just start the recording. Okay. Okay, good morning, everyone. Calling this January 24th meeting of the Cape Cod Public Procurement Officials Association to order at 10:03. First thing on the agenda is the approval of the meeting minutes for November 22nd that was circulated last week. I'm going to need a motion for that if possible. I think most of you are muted, so you might have to unmute yourselves or you can do it in the chat.
Hi, Jen. Can I put forward a motion to approve the meeting minutes, please?
Thank you, Amber. Do I have a second?
Second.
Thanks, Svetlana. Good morning. All those in favor?
Good morning.
You can just raise your hand or put it in the chat.
Aye.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, everyone. All right. So those have passed. The MHAC update, Janet had a family emergency this morning, so she's unable to attend this morning's meeting, but she will be attending our March meeting to give us an update on MHAC. As for OSD, Patricia Burke did have a conflict today, but she did send me some information that I wanted to share with you today quickly. So this month, for the month of January, the OSD local government team had a couple of webinars for professional services contracts. If you missed the first session of January 12th for PRF 69 engineering and PRF 76 for management consulting contracts, she did share the webinar slide deck and recording. So that I will be able to send you the link in the slide deck so that way you can view if you missed it and if you're interested in either one of those contracts. And then there's also a webinar for PRF 70 for advertising, marketing, event planning services, and PRF 75 foreign language interpretation and translation services. That webinar is going to take place on January 26th from 1 to 2. I have the registration link that I can put in the chat today. So if you're looking to register for that soon, I can do that. Statewide contract updates. HSP 45 for laboratory supplies and equipment has just recently replaced HSP 41. It's an educational, healthcare, and scientific laboratory contract covering lab supplies and equipment, including peripherals, furnishings, and related services. ITC 80 for copiers, printers, and related services, which is replacing the ITC 66, offers the purchase, lease, and rental of energy-efficient copiers, printers, micrographic equipment, and digital duplicator scanners, fax machines, remanufactured toner cartridges, and other services and supplies. ITS 80 for information technology, independent research services is replacing ITS 59. That offers subscription-based IT research and advisory services to assist organizations in making informed IT decisions. OSD also added 14 new vendors to their PSE 01 for public safety and two-way radio contract. VEH 114 for automotive parts contract was also enhanced with 12 additional new vendors. And just a reminder, if you haven't already marked your calendar, the Mass Buys 2023 is going to take place on Wednesday, June 7th at the Heinz Convention Center in Boston. I will share this update with you through email, and I will put the registration link if you're looking for that 26th webinar in the chat. So that's the update that I have from Patricia. Also, if you didn't sign in, back to CCAPPO business, if you didn't already sign in, I'll put in again the link to the sign-in sheet so that way you get credit for attending today's presentation. So without further ado, because we might need some time for questions and answers at the end, today I'm happy to welcome Neil Cohen from the Office of the Inspector General, who's going to be doing a presentation for us on fraud awareness and prevention.
Thank you very much,
You're
and
welcome.
good morning to everyone. I was looking at the attendee list for today, and I think a good number of you probably know me either from other trainings or from talking to me on the 30B line. But again, my name is Neil Cohen. If you don't know who I am, I've been with the Office of the Inspector General for, I am about a week away from celebrating my 30th anniversary. So you can all congratulate me next week. You don't have to do that now, but please, because of the ethics rules, no flowers, no candy, nothing like that. I have been doing training and compliance work, mainly the 30B work, for about 4 years now. Prior to that, I was in the investigations division. So most of my career has been spent in oversight and in investigations, but I do enjoy training. I enjoy helping people through our technical assistance process. So if you've never heard of the office before, the Inspector General's office is a state oversight agency. Our mission is to prevent and detect fraud, waste, and abuse. And we try to prevent by having a training program, have technical assistance, so people don't stumble into bad things. There are some people that, of course, intentionally look to do bad things, and all the training and technical assistance in the world won't help them because that's their mission. They're looking to circumvent the laws and commit fraud or abuse. But most people, I think, don't want to stumble into bad things. So it's been many years since I presented to CAPPO, and I'm glad to be back. So thank you for inviting me. So let's get right into fraud, waste, and abuse. I'm sorry, fraud awareness and prevention, the topic for today. At any time, if you have questions, just turn on your microphone and just ask away. I don't mind being interrupted. However, otherwise, keep your microphone off so we don't get that, background noise and, hear you on the phone with somebody or if you're in a school, the bells ringing going off every 46 minutes or whatever it might be. All right, so let's get right into it. There will be a video I need to show you. If you've seen this presentation before, just indulge me. It'll probably be very similar to what you've experienced in the past. I will toggle, it won't play in Teams, so I'll have to stop sharing, load the internet, and then play the video for you. So just bear with me when that happens. That'll be in about 10 slides from now. All right, so fraud awareness and prevention. So I think it's the goal of seeking to, prevent and detect fraud, right, is to stop our jurisdictions from being victimized, stop us from being victimized, to protect the um, the money, the assets, whatever has been entrusted in our care. So to me, what's fascinating about fraud awareness is that there was a study done at this point, it was pre-pandemic, and I'm not sure it's been updated since then, but American Express or Amex did a global survey of both the public and private sector. And the employees they interviewed, or not interviewed, but responded to their survey, 76% of them said that if they saw something that they thought was fraudulent in their organizations, they reported it. There are two things that I find fascinating about that. One is if you go back in time, about 20 years ago, that percentage was probably in the 30% range. And there are two reasons for that. One, employees didn't necessarily know what fraud was. So we've done a great job to raise the level of awareness and explain to people what fraud is and what are some of the red flags they should be looking for. But also, even if people saw something, they didn't know who to report it to. And even if they went to their supervisors, let's say, and reported what they saw, their supervisors may not have known what to do with that information. So we've come a long way in helping the people in our organizations understand what fraud is, how they can possibly prevent it, and what they should do if they see it. Unfortunately, I know this may surprise you, but the public sector tends to score lower in these surveys than the private sector. So the 76% is the average number, but if we just looked at the public sector, that number is probably still in the 50% range or lower. So we do have some work to do in the public sector. And that's why these trainings are important. And we just encourage all jurisdictions to make part of their training routine every year that people take a fraud awareness training. We have a video on our YouTube page that's about 30 minutes long. We do this presentation for anybody who asks. And there are other organizations that do fraud trainings as well. It's not hard to find a fraud awareness training. You just have to want to find it and then have your employees take it. So the key point for today is that detection and prevention cannot occur unless you're aware of what it is, what fraud is. And if you think of any crime prevention training that you've gone to, if the local police have, conducted identity theft prevention or just crime prevention training, if you don't necessarily understand the concept, it's hard to know when you're getting in harm's way. So I just have to, do the required disclaimers that in case I say something that it's me and it's not necessarily the office that's saying that. And if I use any images today, I'm using them for educational purposes pursuant to the fair use doctrine of the copyright law and not violating any federal laws. So what is fraud? So let's start with the concept. This is the very, very simple definition. I'm not an attorney, so I don't use the legal definition. I find it very convoluted and it's not easy to understand, but this one I think is. Fraud is essentially lying to get something that doesn't belong to you. Okay? Lying to get something that doesn't belong to you. So we probably know a lot of people who are fraudsters, right? Our children, possibly siblings. So I know when I was younger, I'm pretty sure that if you had asked my parents and you gave them this definition, they'd say, yep, Neil's a fraudster. Because I'm sure that I've lied, in my younger days to get something that I wasn't entitled to or didn't belong to me, probably a cookie or something like that. So the lie is some type of deceit, it's a concealment, or it's a violation of trust. So somebody intentionally tries to deceive another or deceive an organization. Most frauds that we'll deal with in the public sector involve some type of concealment where people use the data that they have access to or the documents that they have access to look to conceal or cover up the fraud that they're committing. It's an intentional act. So that's the difference between fraud and a lot of other things, is that fraud is intentional. It's not a mistake. Somebody created a scheme to do it. Value could be anything that's of value to the individual committing fraud. We sometimes get distracted and say, well, it has to be money. It's not all about money. Sometimes it's about whatever the individual perceives as value. There was one case that we worked on a number of years ago where an individual working for a state agency committed a fraud because they wanted attention. So that attention was a value to them. They didn't steal anything. They just committed a fraud because they falsely reported about the work they were doing, and they simply did it for attention because other people in the agency were just so impressed by this person's parent work ethic or ability to perform that's all the person wanted. That recognition was the value to them. So people tend to gain from a fraud, but it is not always a tangible gain. So we can't sometimes get lost in, well, there's no money missing, so I guess there's nothing wrong here. We don't know. Fraud is committed by both individuals and it could be committed by organizations, whether it's vendors, corporations. I'm sure you've all heard about over the past few years some of the organizational frauds. Wells Fargo was one where it seemed like it was within one unit within Wells Fargo to deceive customers. And probably a lot of people haven't heard about this one, but there was a bid rigging scheme that was prosecuted by the U.S. Department of Justice. And the bid rigging occurred amongst the tuna fish canners. So if anybody eats tuna, when you go to the supermarket, there's usually like 3 or 4, kind of brand name tunas out there, Bumblebee, Chicken of the Sea, Starkist. They colluded with each other to price fix the prices of a can of tuna. That was a bid rigging fraud. Okay, so what was the damage to us? If you eat tuna fish, you likely, when you bought a can of tuna, probably over the past maybe 5 years, 6 years, you probably paid a little more for that can of tuna. So that was the damage to you. The gain for the tuna companies is that this price fixing or bid rigging allowed them to make sure that they were going to get a profit, that they weren't competing in a fully open and competitive market. So they wound up paying, I forget if it was tens of millions or hundreds of millions collectively in fines and to the U.S. government. Just makes you think. So why should this topic be important to anybody in the public sector, in the government? And by extension, I'm going to say not-for-profits too, because not all, but many not-for-profits get a lot of their revenue from government contracts, especially social service agencies. Not all, but there's a good number that get a lot of their revenue from government programs or government contracts. So according to all the studies that are done, and there are organizations out there like the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners that are constantly doing studies and evaluations. I know as a former investigator, I get these surveys sent to me a couple of times a year asking me about the types of cases that I've worked on, and they compile data internationally. It's really, they deserve a lot of credit for doing this, but government programs, the public sector, and I'm assuming most of us on this call, that's where we work, are considered a high-risk industry for fraud, and that about 25% of all frauds are attributed to the public sector. Now, that could include a lot of individual frauds where if people cheat, on public assistance or on other types of government programs, but it also includes embezzlement, larceny, and a lot of other what I'll call higher level frauds. So you work in a high risk industry for fraud. So that's the number one reason for you to be concerned. Two, if you understand fraud, you're aware of it, it's easier for you to try to prevent it. And prevention is so much easier than detection because detection is much more invasive, it's much more intrusive, it's much more costly. And there's a lot of cleanup that happens. It's like, would you rather prevent the spill from happening or would you prefer to clean up the spill after it happens? It's like an oil spill, right? What would you rather do? I think the vast majority of people, unless you're kind of in the cleanup industry, would say I'd much rather prevent it than to clean up the mess afterwards. Three, it's a cost control measure. Again, those same studies that I was talking about show that about 35%, it's actually every year, if you look at that study, it's creeping up a little bit, that when you do a fraud training for your organizations, it helps to control the losses. There's on average a 35% reduction in the losses that you can incur from a fraud if it hits your organization because your employees are more aware. And of course, if they're more aware, they detect it earlier. So if you detect it earlier, you lose less. The fraud doesn't go on for as long as it would have gone on otherwise. And also, if you learn prevention techniques, you could probably stop it in many cases before it either starts or it gets too far. It's our collective fiduciary duty as public employees because we have been, in all of us, we have been given it's a trust relationship between us and our constituents, whether we call them taxpayers, ratepayers, citizens. We are spending their money and we are operating for them. So it's a trust relationship. So because of that, we have a fiduciary duty to make sure that bad things don't happen while we're on watch. So all the more reason to try to prevent the bad things from happening. It could be fraud. It could be a whole series of things that you might want to control against. So again, nothing bad happens while we're the custodians, the trustees, or we're on watch for the people who have given us some type of trust. And lastly, because fraud happens. Fraud is often a criminal act. And I don't think anyone can say, oh, crime's not going to happen in my jurisdiction, or a crime will never happen. I don't think we can say that. And the difference between fraud and a lot of, I'll call them violent crimes, is that fraud tends to be easier to commit. It's a non-violent crime. It's one of the so-called white collar crimes. So we're going to talk more about that, but it's because it's so easy to do, people who commit it aren't necessarily hardened criminals. We're going to talk about that in a couple of minutes. So, and keep in mind, one of the most pervasive frauds in any organization is time fraud. And we often have very few controls against time fraud. What do I mean by that? Think of the definition of fraud. It's lying to get something that doesn't belong to you. So there's an intentional act. So for those of you who fill out timesheets, if you have to sign your timesheet and you are supposed to work 9 to 5 and you only work 9 to 4 and you don't have the permission of your employer to take the hour, you don't use leave time that you might be entitled to, You simply write down that you worked 9 to 5 and you sign it on a document, which means you did it intentionally, but you don't disclose that you shorted your time by an hour. That's a fraud. Your gain is the value of that 1 hour of time. So think of what an hour of your time is worth. Figure out your hourly rate. Now, what if you're in an organization where that is kind of a routine? It's part of the culture in the organization that, everybody leaves a little early, and I'm not going to call out any jurisdictions, but sometimes, I'm in I can't return phone calls until later in the day. So I'll call some jurisdictions 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock. I not all the time, but in many cases, nobody picks up. So I can't assume that, you know, uh, that's not appropriate, meaning maybe everybody works 7 to 3, or maybe town hall closes early on Wednesday. I don't know, but it's just anecdotal. So if you have everybody shaving, an hour a week from their time, just think about how much that could be at the end of the year. It could be significant money. So it's something of value, and people might look to take advantage. So, all right, so I'm going to have to toggle in a minute to a video. So this is an awareness test. If you've seen it before, maybe you'll get a chuckle again when you see this. So here are the instructions. You'll see two teams. One team is wearing black t-shirts. The other team is wearing white t-shirts. The only thing I'm asking you to do is count the number of times the team in the white t-shirts passes the ball to each other. Okay? Team in white, how many times do they pass the ball to each other? All right, so just give me a second. I have to stop sharing, and I have to load the internet. Okay, hopefully everybody could see this. Don't worry about the sound. If you can't hear it, doesn't matter. Can everybody, can somebody let me know if they can see this up on their screen?
Yes, it's up now.
Okay, terrific. Okay, so all you need to do is watch. Remember, count the number of times the team in white passes. Okay, anybody want to turn on their microphone and tell me how many times the team in white passed the ball to each other?
10.
Okay, anybody else?
13.
13, okay. Anybody see this before? No, okay. All right, now, did anybody see anything else? Did anybody notice anything else strange happening on the screen? There were no wrong answers, so,
You mean the weird bear in the middle of the crowd?
who have you seen this before? How many times did you count that they passed the ball to each other?
11.
Okay. Anybody else see a strange bear, or I'm sorry, who is this that said something about the
Roby.
bear? Okay, maybe so either she's hallucinating, or did anybody, or maybe something did appear on the screen. Anybody see anything? All right, I'm going to continue playing it. So now don't look at the ball. All right, and you'll see what the answer is, but that's kind of irrelevant. It's 13. Okay, so if you didn't get 13, okay.
Watching the bear.
Well, all right. Now just watch it again without keeping your eye on the ball. Did everybody see the bear? Anybody? Anybody see the bear this time?
Yeah, this time, but totally missed it last time.
Right. Okay, so give me a second. I'm going to reload my slides and then let's talk about. Oh, sorry about that. The internet is continuing to play in the background. All right, so can you see the slide deck again?
Yes, sorry, Neil.
Okay,
Yep,
great. Thank you.
no problem.
Okay, so the point of showing this video, if you haven't seen it before, is to kind of test your level of awareness. So I tricked you. I lied to you. I deceived you. I told you to all keep your eye on the ball. So by doing that, and this hopefully will provide you with some context as we continue to talk about the concept of fraud, that I deceived you into watching the ball. And the bear appeared on the screen and walked across the screen. And I'm assuming most of you didn't see it because you were focused on the ball. And in life, in work, our experiences in the workplace, most of us, I think, would say we're pretty busy. We're understaffed. We have a lot on our plates. So our focus tends to be on the ball. The ball represents the work that we do, the stuff that comes across our desk. So who has time to kind of look around and check other things out for fraud? We often don't have the time or the resources to do that. So that also makes it easier for the people, unfortunately, who we work with or that we do business with to kind of distract us. And they can be committing these bad things right before our eyes and we don't see it. So some of the things we're going to talk about in the rest of the presentation is like, what can we do to make sure that we can lift our heads up every once in a while and stop looking at the ball to try to see the bear? So any questions about this? Hey, remember, just turn on your mics if you have any questions. So it's important to remember that fraud can occur at any time to any organization. It can be of any size. It can be really small. It can be, multi-billion dollars. That won't impact most of us because, we don't have that kind of spare money lying around in our jurisdictions. But just like any other crime, if you talk to anybody in law enforcement, they'll tell you that we can't totally prevent crime, but we can do a lot to just discourage it. And discouraging it comes with raising awareness of potential victims, putting controls in place. And I know when I've gone to crime prevention trainings, they always talk about sometimes simple fixes. And we're going to talk more about that later. Not everything that we're talking about as a fraud control or a fraud prevention measure is like some big project that's going to cost, a lot of money to a jurisdiction. Sometimes it's things that we could just put in place that maybe take a little time for us to do periodically, but are not something that we would say, oh, I can't believe it. This is like having a part-time job. It's not always the case. So just some recent examples. We're not going to go through all of these. I mean, you could always look on our website. These are all cases that we worked on, but it just goes to show you kind of the breadth of fraud and how it does occur in Massachusetts in the public sector. It occurs in every state in the United States. It occurs internationally, and it impacts every conceivable type of industry or organization. There, so look, a library. This was the longest embezzlement that I've ever come across in my career. This was the librarian. Who would expect the librarian to be committing a fraud, right? So the librarian probably was ripping off the library for over 40 years. That's the longest fraud that I've ever encountered in my career. A tax collector engaging in a lapping scheme. What a lapping scheme is, this had to do with swapping cash for other forms of payment. So if somebody came in to pay their real property tax bill in cash, the collector took all or part of the cash payment. And then when the next person came in and paid by check, the collector applied either that whole check or part of the check to the first account. Everybody understand what I'm saying? So it was almost like a Ponzi scheme where somebody making a payment, a taxpayer making a payment, was actually paying somebody else's account. So it allowed the collector to pull out cash. And that one fell apart because the collector was pulling too much cash out. So the payments coming in by check were not enough to cover the missing. So this fell apart because, and I know we all may know taxpayers like this, they got a delinquent notice in the mail. And this particular taxpayer, instead of being rational and, just making an inquiry saying, why did I receive this? I paid it. Basically decided to make this a mission in life to figure out why they would get a delinquent notice when they made payment. So instead of going to the collector, this person made a beeline to the select board and, just made a big deal about how ineffective and inefficient the, town hall operations were, that, what a waste for me to get that happens. But it kind of worked out for the good in that it caught this lapping scheme. An executive director of a housing authority, a water district treasurer, and then fairly recently there was a town accountant. It was a contract position. This individual worked for numerous towns and basically embezzled money from all the towns they worked for. I think it was over $1 million that this individual stole collectively from all the towns. So it can happen in any part of the organization. I guess anywhere where there's something of value that somebody wants to obtain. So I mentioned earlier the most common type of fraud is time theft, larceny. So whenever you hear whenever there's a press report, whenever you hear the term by scheme, because sometimes when they talk about somebody getting indicted or somebody getting convicted, they talk about larceny by scheme. So whenever you hear the term scheme or there's something else that comes after larceny, it usually means it was a fraud, because straight larceny is just stealing something. That's like walking into a store, robbing the cash register, which would be more than larceny. But if I just take stuff and I don't care who knows about it, there's no deception, there's no lie, then that's just a straight larceny. But if somebody tries to conceal the larceny, it's um, it's a scheme. So what I put down here is just remember, if it's not nailed down, somebody may try to take it. And even if it's nailed down, they may try to take it if it has value for them. Credit card and purchasing abuse is another very common type of fraud. If any of you use credit cards or procurement cards, you know, you have to make sure you have really layers of controls over that. And we teach, some of you may have taken it, we teach a whole day of procurement fraud where we touch on a lot of the specific abuses that could occur in a procurement environment. We could also be victims to cyber attacks like phishing or fake invoices. There was a retirement board in the central part of the state that was ripped off for hundreds of thousands of dollars because some cyber criminal out there sent a fake invoice via email and it got paid. The retirement board paid it. So what would any good fraudster do? They would say success. So every month they sent another invoice saying, this is your monthly invoice for January, your monthly invoice for February. And somebody at the retirement board was like, oh, they sent this, you know, this is a monthly invoice. We got it last month too, and just paid it. And this went on for a couple of years. So that's a whole, I mean, we could probably spend an hour just talking about that one and how that happened and what controls you can have in place. So any cyber related potential frauds, if you haven't checked into the resources available at the Mass Cyber Center, please do, or refer this information to someone else in the organization. They have a cybersecurity toolkit. They have some training videos. You know, there's a lot of information there, plus links to other agencies that have useful information for you. So when it comes to detecting fraud, if we find it, and I don't mean just think, you know, we see the moonwalking bear, but that doesn't mean the moonwalking bear is dangerous. Maybe the bear is just walking by. But if the bear is committing some type of nefarious activity, we can't ignore it. And I think because of our fiduciary duty, we have an obligation to report it. And I add the next bullet that, because this is from my experience, this is just anecdotal based on my experience, that unfortunately too many jurisdictions, especially governing bodies, don't necessarily want to pursue something against an individual because we say, oh, this person worked for us for, 15 years, a really nice person, has kids, and we look to make excuses for their activity. So, the we don't want to go any further than maybe terminating them or asking them nicely if they'd be willing to pay back what they stole. And we really can't do that because there's a difference between how we feel personally and our responsibility that we have as public officials, as public employees, that fiduciary duty. So on a personal level, and there was a particular case where the Attorney General's office, we had investigated this case, and this was there was a governing body that was really fighting the Attorney General's office and said, we don't want to prosecute. This is a really nice person. We like them. Can't we just ask them to pay back the money? And, the the people from the Attorney General's office said, no, they committed a fraud. They stole hundreds of thousands of dollars from you. This is not like somebody stole your bike and they're willing to return it. This wasn't a prank. that, some high school kid pulled, there was an intentional act or actions, multiple acts that were committed over a 2-year period to fleece this jurisdiction. So on a personal level, you like the person? Okay, great. You can continue to talk to them. You want to hang out with them. You want to donate money to their defense, their legal defense fund. Go for it, because what you do personally is your business. But when you're in the capacity as the public official, you can't you can't make excuses, and you can't just sweep it under the rug. You may get bad press for it, but that's just the way it goes. You have to take the good with the bad. So why does fraud happen? So let's talk a little about theory. This is the academic portion of the presentation. So some of you may have heard of the fraud triangle before. So this is a theory from that goes back to the 1950s, that it was theorized that fraud occurs because of 3 elements. The first element on the bottom of the triangle is pressure or motivation, meaning an individual who wants to commit that intentional act to take something from somebody else has to have the motivation to do it. What could be some of the pressure or motivation? Well, it could be almost anything. Think of what pressures we face, right? We could have bills to pay. We could be on it. Unfortunately, some people have addictions to either gambling, alcohol, drugs, and we've seen more and more of that. Particularly from my experience, gambling and drugs seem to be maybe they're up there on the top 10 list, but not necessarily in the top 5. So it happens. There are things that might motivate us to think about committing a bad act. But just because we think about it, that's not a crime. You have to take it the next step. And to get to the next step, you have to go to the left side of the triangle, that rationalization or justification. So just because I'm motivated to do it, I have to excuse it, because most of us have been acculturated the same way, that there's a common understanding of right versus wrong. From the time we were born, we were told by anybody that we came into contact with, whether it was parents, guardians, relatives, siblings, teachers, religious leaders, and then as we got older, when we entered the workforce, right, we're inundated with codes of conduct and ethics rules. And it's hard for somebody to argue that they don't understand what the collective notion of what is right versus wrong. So we kind of know stealing from somebody is wrong, right? There are very few people out there that will say, like, I never heard that before, right? I mean, it's a common understanding. It's like one of those, truths that we live by in a society. So how do you overcome that? So you need to kind of rationalize why this fraud, or I'll just use the term theft, why is this theft okay, given that we know that stealing is wrong? So how do you rationalize that? People come up with all types of rationalizations, but usually the big ones are, I'm not really stealing it, I'm borrowing it. And I'll tell you, I've heard that probably dozens of times over the years, that when somebody gets caught, they say, I always intended to pay it back. I just never had the opportunity. So you rationalize it by saying you didn't steal it, you're just borrowing it. Other times people say, look, everybody's doing it, especially with time theft. Everybody leaves at 4:00. I don't want to be the only, idiot that stays till 5. That could happen. Sometimes people hate their organizations, or they hate their bosses. So it's a form of retribution. It's like, or when things are bad or you have a jurisdiction that's not very generous with their employees, you haven't gotten a raise in a while, or the select board and town meeting felt that they were extremely generous by giving you a 1%, raise for the next 3 years. So sometimes people say that's ridiculous, and if they're not going to give it to me, I'm going to take it. So there are a lot of rationalizations that people can have. But then lastly, and this is something that is really fundamental about this training and why it's important for you to take the prevention measures, or what we discuss about prevention, to heart, is that even if you're motivated and you justify it, you need to have the opportunity to do it. And the opportunity is that proverbial unlocked door. Why am I making it easy for somebody? And if you go to any crime prevention training, they'll say, look, lock your car door, because there are sometimes people that just walk up and down the street, or that go from car to car in a parking lot, and they just try the door handles. And guess what? If the door opens, they're going to steal what's in there. So if you lock the door, they're going to move on to the next car. They're going to look for that opportunity. So what can we do in our organizations to limit the opportunity? That is completely in our control. We cannot control the way people think, what motivates them, or how they rationalize things. But we certainly can prevent or the fraud from happening by thinking about where the opportunities exist for the bad act to happen, and then what can we do to try to prevent it. Again, we may not be able to prevent everything, but if it's as simple as locking the door, then lock the door. Because sometimes we leave the door unlocked because we don't think about it. Who would want to come in here? What could they possibly steal? And then if you remember that list of cases I talked about, there was one embezzlement scheme where people went to lunch and they didn't lock the office door. So somebody came back from lunch and they were able to, kind of steal some money and go into the system and kind of change things around. And, so it's as simple as, okay, if we're going to lunch and there's money in here, we're locking the door. Period. So you never know. All right, there's a corollary to the rule, or to the triangle, called the 80-10-10 rule. And this rule says that about 10% of the population will just never commit a fraud, because those restraints, what we'll call psychosocial restraints or cultural restraints, are just so strong that the rationalization part of the triangle never happens. They just can't. They just can't rationalize committing a wrong, right? Right versus wrong. Now, 5 to 10% of the population, unfortunately, really have very strong sociopathic tendencies. And what does that mean? They don't accept what the rest of us have accepted. We understand what is right versus wrong, and we have that common understanding. They could care less. If it's they are only concerned about what's right for them. We may know people like this, whether they're selfish, whether they are narcissists, but the extreme sociopaths are the ones that commit violent crimes. The real extreme sociopaths or psychopaths are, the serial killers, but luckily it's a very, very small percentage of the population. But we all tend to have sociopathic tendencies, or at least 90% of us have some type of sociopathic tendency. And, it gets exhibited in a lot of different ways, but not necessarily in fraud. Sometimes we just, if we defy things, and if we do something that we know we shouldn't do, that's a sociopathic tendency because it's antisocial. It's against the norm. It doesn't mean it's wrong. For example, if I dye my hair orange, that might be considered a sociopathic tendency because it's outside the norm, but, it's nothing wrong with it. That's who are you hurting by doing that? But unfortunately, some sociopathic tendencies do lead to harm to others. So because we all have some type of sociopathic tendency, and if you don't believe me, think about when you were a teenager. If your parent, guardian, or teacher ever told you to do something and you were defiant, that's sociopathic tendency. All right. So the most interesting part of this theory is that 80% of the population, given the conditions of the triangle, especially opportunity, might, and I'll say might, commit the bad act, because the vast majority of frauds that are found are not committed by these, psychopaths or sociopaths. They're committed by average people who just kind of fell into it because they had pressure on them. They were able to rationalize a bad act, and there was an opportunity for them to do it. And most of these people wouldn't continue to do it if they were caught early or it was difficult for them to do, because they still have that restraint. Deep in the recesses of their mind, they know that it's wrong to do it. But if you make it easy, that's why sometimes when you uncover frauds, you see that somebody tested the waters. It's like going into a cold pool or the ocean, right? Not everybody dives right in. You kind of go up to your ankle, then you go up to your knee, then you go up to your waist. And then when you acclimate, you go right in. So people commit frauds the same way. They kind of dip their toe in and they test it. So if the opportunity exists, they'll go a little more and a little more and a little more until it becomes routine. And before you know it, years go by and it's become just kind of part of doing business is to embezzle funds from your jurisdiction. So the typical fraudster. So in the 2021 report to the nation that, again, that the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners puts out on an annual basis, the people who commit fraud, here's the profile. 38% are in management. 50% are between the ages of 36 and 50. Now, for the first one, for being in a management position, it's because you have authority. So maybe you have the ability to, change things in the system that other people don't have. 50% being 36 to 50, it's because at that age, we tend to have gone into management ranks. We've been in an organization long enough where you kind of know where the bodies are buried. You know the system really well. 65% are male. Well, it doesn't mean that this is a gender-based crime, because the number, this is 2021 that this information came out. Again, if you go back like 20 years, this number was probably over 90%. So what this says is that the more that women go into management positions or gain authority in the workplace, they might be susceptible to the triangle as well. So it's not a gender-based crime. It's a crime of opportunity. So we need to keep that in mind too. 25% have been with the organization for 10 or more years. Okay, that's significant because again, these people understand the system. And that last bullet on the bottom is that when you've been with the organization for a while and you've proven yourself, you tend to be trusted, you're given a lot of responsibility, you're respected, you're friends with everybody. So people don't suspect that you would be someone who would do this. And 85%, think about the 80% from the 80-10-10 rule. 85% of people who are found to commit a fraud, this is the first time they're doing anything bad. These are not seasoned criminals. Okay, they've really never done anything that would involve them with law enforcement or, and it kind of, whenever I watch the TV news, which I kind of hate to do because it's depressing, but when you watch the TV news and they usually find, somebody doing something bad and they go to the neighbor, this is kind of par for the course, right? They go to the neighbor and they shove the microphone in the neighbor's face and they say, "Hey, did you know the guy next door was a serial killer?" And, invariably the answer is, no, I had no idea. I've never seen anybody say, "Yep, I knew. I knew." You know, yeah, I'm surprised he wasn't caught years ago. That never happens because it people don't do things, if they're trying to deceive you, they don't want people to know that they're committing something bad. So it's not, you wouldn't know it. And the other important thing is that 42% deal with something or have access to money or something of value. So you could work in the accounting office, some type of payment position, or contracting. Contracting and procurement is up there as one of the big parts of an organization that are vulnerable to fraud. So the typical fraud, I think what's important for all of us is that municipal level frauds average about $80,000 and they last for about 2 years. Now, they last for about 2 years for a couple of reasons. One is that it's difficult to sustain this house of cards. Like the collector example I used earlier, sometimes you literally run out of money to cover your tracks. But it's also difficult. It's like having a part-time job. So people get sloppy. The other reason is the audit cycle. Not that audits identify fraud, and I'm going to talk about that in a second. But in some cases, people get greedy, so they just take too much. And it comes to the attention of an auditor because they'll look at the books and they'll say something doesn't make sense. If you're taking in this much and this much is going out, something is not making sense here. Or why are you spending so much on this? It kind of raises a flag. So we're going to talk about audits in another couple of minutes. So the top causes of fraud, a lack of internal controls is number one. All those studies I'm talking about, when they diagnose why something happened, number one is lack of internal controls. Two is a lack of management oversight. That's kind of not taking your eyes off the ball and looking for the moonwalking bear. Number three, override of controls. This is when we have these really elaborate controls or standard operating procedures, and yet somebody with authority, usually in some type of management position, gets to say, don't worry about it. And one of the cases that I worked on, it was a school superintendent that was basically committing an expense reimbursement fraud against the school district. And the way that this worked is that whenever the superintendent would submit either one of the reimbursement forms that the school district had, or the superintendent had a school issued credit card. So whenever the credit card statement came in and they went to him, he didn't want anybody looking at it. All that he said to the school business people were that I reviewed the credit card, pay it. And the same thing with the expense reimbursement requests. He didn't submit receipts as was required by the policy, and there was nobody who signed off on his expense reimbursement. I know if I ever have to submit an expense reimbursement in my office, if I don't submit a receipt, I don't get reimbursed. And also, about 3 people have to review my request before it gets approved. So this was a total override of controls in this particular school district, and poor tone at the top. So tone at the top, if you've never heard that term before, is essentially saying the culture of the organization. So there are just some organizations out there that the tone is do whatever you want. It's just so laid back, and sometimes the tone is set by leadership, where if, you know, the head of the department, you know, comes in at 11 o'clock in the morning and leaves at 2 in the afternoon and does very little work while they're there, what kind of tone is that setting for the rest of the organization? Then I guess it's okay. It's okay not to put in a full day. It's okay not to do your work, but that also could be for other things too, and I don't mean to pick on DPWs, but let's say the director of the DPW has a business on the side and, takes the equipment that the town owns and uses the town-owned equipment on, for the private work. If that's okay with the director, why isn't it okay with me? For me. So if I have some work to do in my house, or maybe I'm doing some work on the side, I'll just take the equipment too. So that would be an abuse, probably an ethics violation. It's only a fraud if you steal the equipment and then try to cover up for it. But all these things, internal controls, oversight, override, tone at the top, are opportunities that we allow to happen. They're easily correctable. So we all know what the costs of fraud are, right? The actual loss, damage, reputation. Nobody likes those articles in the press about how corrupt our community is. The costs, remember when I said earlier, cleaning up the spill is so much more expensive, so much more difficult than preventing the spill from happening in the first place. So the costs just go up exponentially when you're in the detection or investigative mode for a fraud. Mission distraction. If you're busy dealing with the cleanup, what happens to the work that you have to do on a day-to-day basis? And also employee morale. These are people we work with. These are not strangers. This is not somebody that just bopped in for the day to commit a fraud against us, right? Most of the time, it's somebody that we've been sitting next to, talking to, complaining to. We may have invited them to events, to family events that we've had. They could have been over our house for dinner. Maybe we go out for drinks. We consider them friends, and before my eyes, they were ripping off the organization that we both work for, and I had no idea. So how could that not affect your morale or the way you feel about things? So red flags. Red flags are warnings, but they're not evidence. So we have to be careful. And again, think of the bear. The bear walks right in front of you. It doesn't mean the bear is dangerous or is trying to do something bad, but it should give us pause, right? We should say, what the hell is the bear doing here? So we need to ask ourselves what's happening. So some common red flags are a lack of supporting documentation for any transaction, an action without adequate justification. So when the superintendent said, just pay the credit card and I don't need to show you the receipts, or I don't need to show you even the credit card statement, that's an issue. So that would be actions without justifications, and then lack of responsiveness or a lack of reporting. And, in most cases, if we ask for information, somebody should be able to provide us with information fairly quickly, especially if it's to support a transaction, right? So if you ask a vendor, say, I don't understand this invoice. It says for services rendered, $25,000. What services rendered? Can you elaborate? They should be able to give you that information pretty quickly. If it's going to take them weeks or months to get you that information, that's a big red flag. Other red flags would be audit findings. We can't ignore audit findings. And some of the audit reports where the auditor issued management letters to the jurisdiction, they get issued and reissued year after year, and nobody does anything about it. So that's like somebody screaming from the rooftop and people ignore them. Complaints. If you get complaints from constituents or other vendors, we don't like to hear it. Sometimes it's the same people complaining about everything, but we still need to hear what they're saying because there could be something, there could be a grain in what they're complaining about. We experience this. I mean, we have, people who call our fraud hotline, every week. And probably 90% of what they complain about is there's nothing to it. But every once in a while, they kind of hit on something that uh, gives us a predication to look into something some more. Resistance to rules and oversight, that's that sociopathic tendency we talked about earlier. So if you have anybody in your organization that's resistant to following rules or it pushes back on oversight, either they have a personality disorder or they're looking to cover up something. You need to figure that out because 80% of frauds exhibited some type of red flag. So, and people didn't see it. It was the moonwalking bear. And 80% of the cases, the moonwalking bear is right there, traipsing back and forth, and we don't see it. What is your primary anti-fraud control? Think about it. It's a rhetorical question. In most cases, when I ask this question and people have an opportunity to answer, they say audits. Audits are their number one control. When I was an investigator and I would show up at a jurisdiction, probably 8 out of 10 times, the head of the organization would say, "Why is the Inspector General's office here? We had a clean audit." Well, audits are not meant to detect fraud. The auditing standards that every CPA follows when they do one of your audits, the auditing standards simply say you have to be aware of fraud. That's like getting a warning that if you walk outside in the rain, there's a chance that you might get hit by lightning. Okay, all right, but that doesn't prevent me from walking outside when it's raining if I have to. But audits detect less than 10% of the frauds that are out there. It's not to say audits are not important, but they're not an anti-fraud tool necessarily. Now, you can ask your audit firms to look at specific things in addition to their normal routine, but that would be probably at extra cost to you, but it's something to think about. So what is your anti-fraud program in your jurisdiction? So my advice is to think about it. Talk to your coworkers, your peers, folks in other departments, and just do an inventory or create a listing of what you think your anti-fraud measures are, and then evaluate whether they're working. And again, I'll use the example of a lock on the door. Just because we have a lock on the door, but 10,000 people have the key to that lock, doesn't mean it's an effective lock because there's easy access to it. And you'll never know if somebody comes in because so many people have keys. So you have to evaluate how effective these anti-fraud measures are. So in another example from many years ago, it was another collector's office. They had a camera. They had a camera. That was their anti-fraud measure. They had a camera that was focused on the cashier station. Guess what? Camera was never plugged in. And nobody knew. How effective is that? Think about what else you can do. And you could do that by, hiring a consultant, talking to your annual auditor, brainstorming amongst yourselves, giving us a call. Think about what else you can do to beef up or improve your program. Review your risk profile, and you do that through a fraud risk assessment. Fraud risk assessments come in all shapes and sizes. There's no particular science to it. A lot of your annual auditors will recommend that you do a fraud risk assessment. If I were a procurement officer in a community and I had in my function, my fraud risk assessment would just be amongst my team. And it's basically a brainstorming session. We ask ourselves, if somebody wanted to rip us off, how could they do it? And who knows your systems best than the people who work with you every day, who operate those systems? So it's like, if we all know where the flaws are in our systems, or we should know. So once we identify those, we can take steps to try to correct those flaws or their weaknesses. Any step you take to prevent fraud is better than taking no step at all. Okay? So for the people who are saying, I don't have the time for this, or even if it's a baby step, like plugging in the camera, or occasionally changing the lock on the door, or changing your passwords for your computer systems, checking with IT to see if your firewalls have been updated. These are small steps that you can take, not costly, but something is better than nothing. So basic prevention techniques would be to have written procedures and policies that are reasonable and that are enforceable. There's no value to having elaborate policy or procedure that nobody can follow and that nobody is checking to see that it's actually being followed. Because if it's on paper and people are ignoring it, then it's not worth the paper that it's written on. Having some level of oversight. When you have those annual audits every year, the auditors do sampling. They don't check every transaction. Neither do you. But maybe people in management positions and supervisory positions, their oversight can consist of sampling, just in random sampling, just as a check on things. Documentation to make sure that all transactions have the adequate documentation as you require. If you require it and it's not provided, question is why, and then make sure that it's provided. Training, as I mentioned earlier, training could be very valuable and can be a cost control measure. Vendor outreach. So we probably get about 10 calls a week, people saying, procurement folks from around the state saying, I only got one bid. Can I take the one bid? So we answer that question depending on the situation, but then we would typically say, well, why aren't people bidding? Maybe you need to take the next step and ask other vendors or think about the communities around you and say, I don't understand. Why aren't they bidding on my work? Why don't they like me? So it could be something that you're doing wrong. Maybe your specifications or your terms and conditions are just too difficult for somebody to to deal with, or maybe there's something going on in the marketplace that is tantamount to a fraud, whether it's bid rigging or collusion, or something else. There was one case where, we were told there was a vendor out there that had connections to organized crime that basically threatened other people not to submit bids. So that isn't a fraud, but that's criminal. So you never know until you ask. Vendor verification. Do we check to make sure that we know where this vendor is? That we don't have multiple vendors in our systems? And this happens a lot. People will create phantom vendors, or in that case I talked to you about the retirement board, that somebody just sent an invoice via email, pay it, and it looked legit, so somebody paid it. We just have to make sure that we understand who we're paying and why, and that because it's so easy now for people out there, for fraudsters to fake information and create fake invoices. So we have to be very careful, and they will see. I mean, they'll go in your trash, they'll look through your mail, they'll look at your, maybe somebody put in a public records request to see who, maybe there's an innocuous public records request saying, I want I want to know who you pay. Like at the state level, all that information is available online. Every agency, if you want to see what vendors they pay. So what if I'm a bad guy and I decide that I'm going to sneak in an invoice to that same vendor? Because technology, computers, software packages, you can probably fake anything. So you have to be very careful. A contract compliance review, that would be just looking at your vendors to see if they're complying with the contract and to make sure that they're doing everything that they're required to do. Because if they're not, are they doing it because the contract wasn't enforced, or is there something else going on with perhaps somebody else in the organization who's telling the vendor, don't worry about it, it's okay, well, we'll look the other way on this. Some more advanced techniques, and unless you have a large jurisdiction, to set up a hotline or some other reporting mechanism. Everyone in your jurisdiction, remember the second slide in the presentation where I said 76% of employees say if they see it, they report it. They have to know where to report it to. So even if you don't have a hotline, maybe you set up your town council, or there's somebody that they can report fraud to, the police chief, somebody. And if you don't want to do it internally, then do it externally. We have we have an 800 number. People can report it to us. It's very easy to do. If you don't want to do us, you could do the Attorney General's office. You could do the Cape Cod District Attorney. Pick somebody who's willing to accept those calls. So there has to be a reporting mechanism, have more frequent audits, reviews, inspections, and they would be tailored specifically to try to identify fraud. A zero tolerance policy. It's that slide I have that I had that said you can't excuse it. Zero tolerance, because it does create a deterrent effect. So for the sake of time, I'll skip the other bullets because I think they're self-explanatory. So overall, you need to have, for your fraud prevention program or process, you need a plan. And when you outline the plan or the program, make sure that it gets updated and that you implement it. It doesn't have to be implemented all at once. It can happen in phases. It can happen over time, as long as you have the direction to go in. Because again, doing something is better than doing nothing. And doing nothing just is inviting somebody to take advantage of the opportunities that exist. So what should you do in your jurisdiction if somebody detects a fraud? So as I said on the prior slide, you need to have a plan. What do you do? A lot of jurisdictions have plans that, what do you do if you're getting a storm? Unfortunately, in school districts, they have to have active shooter plans. There are all types of plans that organizations have. We should have a fraud reaction plan. What do we do? But if you only see one of those red flags we talked about, again, who do you call? And a lot of jurisdictions don't know what to do. Their knee-jerk reaction is talk to legal counsel, and it becomes more of a how do we prevent this from blowing up? It shouldn't be, in my mind, it shouldn't be something that you're going to prevent blowing up. It's something that you need to get to the bottom of and make sure that you're not being a victim. It's not a matter of embarrassment or political embarrassment. That's going to happen anyway. If you find evidence, be very, very careful. Please, you must consult with either your local police or your town council, because there are some jurisdictions that, again, don't know what to do when they come across the evidence, and they really mess up the future investigations because they didn't know how to handle the evidence. And, the worst case I have in my memory is that there was a jurisdiction that really found evidence somebody was stealing money. And what they did is they just confronted the person in the office, like, are you stealing money? And the person said no. And then the person quit. And, it just made it a lot more difficult to, kind of unravel what happened. So I try to pull it all together by saying, think about speeding, right? And think of speeding in the context of the triangle. So this is similar to the awareness video that we did. So in the context of the triangle, I'm assuming none of you have driven above the speed limit. Okay. So we're suspending disbelief. So assume you're driving above the speed limit. Why would you do that? What would motivate you to do it? So think about it. And then what would be your rationalization? I'm sure that we don't consciously think about it, but how would we rationalize it, or why would we drive above the speed limit in the first place? Now think about the opportunity. What allows us to do it? We don't think we're going to get caught. We don't see any police, right? There are no speed bumps in the road. But think about when there might be some deterrent force. If we know that when we drive on a particular highway or a particular road, there's a speed trap, we slow down before we come to the speed trap. If you're driving on a highway and you look in your rear view mirror and you see way back some type of vehicle and it looks like, something is on the roof of the vehicle, in an instantaneous reaction to that, your foot goes to the brake pedal to slow down, right? So the controls that we have in all our organizations, and the controls are set up for the 80%. The 80% who might, unfortunately, take the opportunity to commit the bad act. So anything that we can do to kind of slow down, and that's what controls are. Controls are stop signs, red lights, police cruisers on the side of the road. That's what controls are. They're just to make people kind of slow down so we can catch somebody driving above the speed limit. So final takeaway for everybody today is it's okay to trust, but we need to verify because it's our fiduciary duty. Ask questions. Don't just accept. There are always questions we could ask. And the number one question is why? Be skeptical. Don't just accept things at face value if they don't make sense. Trust your gut and be proactive. Because again, being proactive and try to prevent the bad thing from happening is really significantly better than waiting until the spill happens and then having to clean it up. So we do have our 800 number. If you need to use that as a place to refer people if something happens or you need to contact us, it's anonymous. It's confidential under our statute. And even if you just want to toss something out, and we get calls like this all the time, it'll be somebody that doesn't want to give us their name, which is fine. And they'll say, in my jurisdiction, I saw a moonwalking bear walk by and I want to know what I should do about it. And we'll talk with that person, because sometimes people just need a place to bounce something off of somebody. They're not necessarily reporting something bad happening. So that's the end of the formal part of the presentation. I hope everybody enjoyed it. And I thank you all again for inviting me. And I'm available to answer any questions that anybody might have.
Okay. Thanks, Neil. Are there any questions? Just keep in mind you might be muted, so feel free to unmute yourselves. Or you can always type it in the chat.
Anybody still awake? by a show of hands?
No, it was
Alright.
very good. I don't have any questions, but it was very good. Thank you so much.
Great.
All right, thank you. All right, so if you do
Yeah.
have any questions, just reach out to us. You know how to find us. If you call the 30B hotline, you could just leave a message for me. I'll get back to you. Some of you may have my direct contact information as well. So,
Neil, one quick question, actually. Are you going to be able to share your slide deck?
yeah, sure, I can
Yeah.
do that. You want me
Yeah,
to,
would you
you want
mind?
me to send it to you?
Just so I can make it
Sure.
available. Yeah, I'll make it available to
Okay.
members because I know there were some that had to kind of hop off, but I mean, it is recorded either way, so. Great.
Okay, yeah, I'll send you a PDF version of the
Thank you
slide deck.
so much. Awesome.
Okay, great. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Next time, invite me to a live presentation in like July or August.
We do
but-
actually have a meeting in July, so we could, absolutely. Somewhere outdoors, preferably. We'll see what we can do.
Right. All right. Thanks.
Sounds
All
good.
right.
Thanks, Neil.
All right. Take care, everybody.
Have a great day.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye. Okay, and for everyone else still on the call, I'm just gonna do a very quick update because I know we're already up for time, but I wanted to do a quick update on the county bids and where we are at the moment. So I'm hoping to get all of the bids that we did in the late fall, early winter wrapped up as best I can tomorrow, and get those awarded and contracts completed. Any renewals that we have for the construction items will also be going up for renewals. Trades that have renewals available will also be on the agenda for next week. So the commissioners will have a very full agenda, but I'm looking for towns to just confirm were already sent bid tables and everything last week, just to confirm that the pricing looks good for the roadway specific projects, construction items, golf course materials, and the portable toilets. So those are the 4 that I will hopefully be awarding tomorrow. For the construction items, I do have references out for K5 because they have done some questionable work for the county in this past year. So I'm waiting to hear back on those as far as how to move forward on that. And as for the portable toilets bid, also the low bidder had some very questionable work. I'll leave it at that for this past year. So again, we're just putting together that documentation and awarding to the next bidder. So once those are completed, after next week, contracts executed, everything updated on the website, we'll be moving on to the winter/spring bids. So you'll probably be hearing from me, hopefully in the next couple of weeks, on the gasoline, diesel, fuel oil, paper, and water chemicals so that we can get kind of those rolling and ready for spring bids. Any questions on that at the moment? Hi, Peter. Do you have a question?
Yeah, Jen, yeah, just from Falmouth, I just had a quick question. You mentioned the portable toilets.
Yeah.
That's the first I'm hearing about that. So the county actually does a contract for the portable toilets? Because in
Yep.
the summertime in Falmouth,
We do it
we have a
annually.
high bid. We have them in all our parks, parks, beaches, all throughout town. So
Yeah,
it'd be
yeah,
a
we do
big
it
help for
annually.
us.
Yeah, yep, we do it annually. We usually do it in the fall because some of them, I want to say the contract starts in like March,
Yeah.
just to kind of mobilize everything and get everything ready. But yeah, we do it on an annual basis. So I usually provide an update at these CCAPPO meetings just to let everybody know. So that way, if there's anyone in their jurisdiction that's interested, but I can certainly make a note to make sure
Yeah,
to let you know next year. I can do that.
next year we would be good. What
All right.
happens is the
Yeah.
Public Works is basically taken on, we started it, so we're basically taking on the whole town. So it's increased.
Oh, wow.
It's at least
Yeah.
doubled. So
Okay.
we'll definitely jump on next year.
Yeah, I would say what I might do is just send you the format, because it's, what locations, if you have like a general date, service times, how many times per week, that sort of thing. So
Yeah.
I can send that over, and then I'll just put a notification in my FY24 bid, just to make sure to reach out to you, along with everybody that's already kind of on it. So I
That'd
can
be great.
absolutely do that. Yeah.
Yeah, that'd be a
Um,
big help. Thank you.
did you put that out to bid yet, or no?
No, we will be. The last like
Okay.
3 or 4 years, we have one vendor that we put it out, one vendor responds.
Okay. Okay.
It's been very good to us, but it's just each year it's just building and building and building. So
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
I
Yeah.
think if we got onto the county, it'd be a lot easier for us.
It'll be a lot easier, maybe if some cost savings, that
Yep.
if vendors see that they can add another town, sometimes they
Oh.
sharpen their pencil a little bit. So
Yeah,
it
absolutely.
definitely might be worth it. All right. Yeah, no
That'd be
problem.
great. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll do that. I'll do that. Anything else? Any other questions? If not, you know how to reach me. And if anyone's still on, I guess I'll entertain a motion to adjourn.
I'll motion to adjourn. It's Laura Yormouth.
Hi, Laura. Thank you. Do I have a second?
I'll second it.
Thanks, Peter. All right. All those in favor. All right. We are adjourned at 11:38. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you, Jen. Have a great day.
You too. Thank you so much.
All righty.